We've been in a series. The title of the series is called In Your Face. And the series is really about relationships, how we get along with each other, whether it be husband, wife, boyfriend, girlfriend, significant other, parent, child, these relationships in the house, these relationships on the job. And these last couple of weeks, especially last week, we began to approach relationships from the standpoint of what is it really that men are thinking? What is it really that women are thinking? Last week, we talked about thinking like a man, and it was rather controversial. There were some great questions that have been lifted. And remember, through these next few weeks, I'll be picking another person. Sister Missa had the lead, but I know that she may be out again with her physical therapy over the next couple of weeks. I'll be reappointing someone else that'll be accepting questions. But I want us to really, especially tonight, if you would be so kind to not to necessarily interrupt the lecture. Tonight I would ask us just to listen, write your questions down, and then we'll take questions, probably the majority of our questions next week. But I wanted us to at least be able to listen. And what we're talking about tonight is thinking like a man. Now, in order for us to get the most as a class, as group therapy, to get the most out of each lesson, I really want us to approach it not from the standpoint of necessarily trying to change a person, and we can't necessarily say that every single principle will apply to every situation. That is not the intent. We will argue all day if we try to say, well, my man is not like that, or I'm not going through that, or that's not for everybody. No, but the goal and how we all can really get the most out of the lesson tonight and even next week is the goal is for us to have some options, to kind of have something to contrast our way of thinking. Sometimes it's just good to hear another viewpoint, or maybe why a particular person, or why the situation, or why the outcome came out the way it did. Sometimes in our own narrow-mindedness, and sometimes from our own social location, our own standpoint, we really can't see what that picture really looks like on the other side. And so thank God for his word. All of our lessons is modeled from God's word. We use his word as our guide. And I wanted, again, this has really been a popular conversation, even among our church, thinking like a man, and then as I was shaking hands last Sunday, somebody said, well, Pastor, it's really going to be interesting when you shift and we start talking about thinking like a woman, because how can a man think like a woman? And again, the answer is we're using the Bible as our biblical model. And the Bible has given us what I call, you got good girls and you got bad guys, and vice versa, bad guys, good girls throughout the Bible. What was that? The Wild Women of the Word. So what we'll be doing over the next few weeks is looking at some female characters of the Bible. Delilah, let the church say amen. Samson, we'll be looking at Jezebel. We'll be looking at various characters, and we'll kind of follow their thinking, follow their mindset, and see what type of situations we end up in. But tonight, every Bible, real quick, let's go. St. Luke, chapter 15. Tonight, we're talking about thinking like a man. One of the questions that I want to wrestle with tonight against this particular text of the prodigal son, I want to wrestle with this question. Sister, we'll not have to start calling names, but here's the question that we will be answering, and the answer just kind of comes out a number of different ways. Here's the question. How do we minimize or eliminate bruising a male ego, especially when dating after divorce? Let me give you the question again. How do you minimize or eliminate bruising a male's ego while dating, especially after a divorce? It's a very, very good question. Very good question. So what we're going to do tonight is we are going to revisit a very popular passage of Scripture. It's found in St. Luke chapter 15, verse 11 through 24. It gives us the prodigal son. And for those of you that are not familiar with the prodigal son, one of the things that we see right away in the reading of the prodigal son is that you see it right there in verse 11, where it says, a certain man had two sons. So let's break this up. We're going to look at, again, St. Luke 15, 11 through 24. I just want us to, if I can get a couple readers just to maybe read 5 verses, and then we'll get another voice to read. So we're reading from Luke 15, 11 through 24. If I could just get the first reader to get us started. If you would just read 5 verses, and then we'll hear another voice, 5 verses, and then the last reader will conclude again at verse 24. And we're reading, and I want us to, at this time, as we listen to the reading of the prodigal son, God's holy word, I want us to kind of try to get inside of the mind of this young man. What is he really trying to do? What is he really up to? I want us to all on one accord have the thinking of this young man, and let's see what happens. Okay, who's going to be the first reader? Go ahead.
And he said, a certain man had 2 sons, and the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me the portion of goods that falleth to me. And he divided unto them his living. And not many days after, the younger son gathered all together, and took his journey into a far country, and there wasted his substance with righteous living. And when he had spent all, there arose a mighty famine in the land, and he began to be in want. And he went and joined himself to a citizen of that country, and he sent him into his field to feed swine.
Okay, great. Next reader.
And he was longing to be fed with the pods that the pigs ate, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, How many of my father's hired servants have more than enough bread, but I perish here with hunger? I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants. And
Okay.
he arose and came to his father. But while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion, and ran and embraced and kissed him.
Okay, next reader.
And the son said unto him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in thy sight, and I am no more worthy to be called thy son. But the father said to his servants, Bring forth the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet. And bring hither the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and be merry. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and is found, and they began to be merry.
Okay, now let's try to take this parable. Jesus often taught in parables. We can debate whether or not we want to say that this is real or not real. That wasn't the point. Jesus gives us these earthly stories that have heavenly meaning to it. Some people would say it's just that. It's just this made-up scenario story. Others believe, and I'm one of them that really believe this really happened. This is really a true parable, a true story. And we can begin to pull up some of the things that kind of points towards what holds so true about this. It happens all the time. Look at verse 12. And the younger of them said to his father, Father, give me my portion of goods. Give me what belongs to me. And the Bible tells us that the father divided them unto his living. Now, right away, tonight we're talking about thinking like a man. Thinking like a man. One of the things that we see right away in that verse is the father really accepted the son's request. This will be, for those of you that are Sunday school teachers, again, I'm teaching this from a total different angle. Some of us are so familiar and have heard this and been in church a long time. This is really going to be from a whole different angle that you never looked at the prodigal son ever before. The father did not try to talk his son out of his request. The son says, Dad, I'm ready for mine. Typically in that Jewish culture, after the father dies, he would get his inheritance. Here he is asking for his early. And the father accepts that. He do not try to change his mind. Don't try to talk him out of it. Don't give him all this set of rules. but he simply honors his request. That says a lot to the dating world and to spouses in marriage about not trying to change people, but just accepting them. What if in our relationships, what if we did just that? What if we spent less time correcting and then more time accepting? You know, we like to work hard at, no, if I can just get you to do this and you need to be doing that and you're doing that. Well, what if as much energy and emotion that we put in fixing the person, you know, what if we put that much time, effort, and energy in just saying, you know what, I'm going to accept that. Acceptance. The Father, there's no arguing, there's no debating. The Father moves to this point in this young man's life where he, okay, if that's really what you want, then here it is. I give it to you. Acceptance. One thing that I need to point out about acceptance says, I'm going to let the person be exactly who they are. Whether we like that idea or not, you know, whether we think, you know, that this person should be different, acceptance says, just the way you are, I'm going to accept you like that. Imagine what God will do with us and them if we're able to accept them as they are. Let's move a little further in that same verse. Not only do I see acceptance, but I also see, some would say that, well, he's breaking his relationship with his father. I mean, he wants to go. He wants to get out. It's right there in verse 12. Give me my portion so I can go. I want to get my life started, get it going. Now notice that's in verse 12. Look at verse 11. And he said, a certain man had 2 sons. And this is just my own personal belief. Nowhere in here is it mentioned about a mother or a mom. It just says a man and his 2 sons. So based off of the reading, we are assuming and we're setting up this single household. Again, a strong message to the dating world, to singles, and to those getting married. Here is a father, certain man, and he had 2 sons. There was no mother there, at least according to the Bible. Just because we're dating somebody, and man, I'm going to need you to say amen tonight. Don't leave me out here by myself. In the dating world and in the marital relationship, the woman is not the mother. People like to, there's a lot of articles out to talk about men will marry people like their mother. And the misconception in that is that men welcome the nagging, they welcome the bickering, and they welcome the demanding, when all of that is wrong. No, we're talking tonight about thinking like a man. Next, in a couple of weeks, of course, we'll talk about why the demanding and why a lot of the emotional stir is needed and necessary. But tonight, we're talking about accepting the man as he is and understanding his commitment. Now, whenever I say commitment, some women would argue that men don't like commitment. Think about our dating relationships. There would be some that would say, I cannot, Pastor, get Ray to commit. He do not want a commitment. And what I would argue back is not so much that he don't want commitment or he don't like commitment or he don't honor commitment, thinking like a man. The problem with commitment for men is what commitment looks like. So commitment, just in listening to the word, commitment sounds like no freedom. Sounds like prison. Sounds like jail. Commitment sounds like I lose who I am. My idea, my thoughts about my life and what I see, my passions and my dreams coming true, it all gets blown away when I start thinking about especially a long-term commitment. So here's the good approach. Instead of hounding, I'm talking about a dating relationship, instead of hounding him about commit. We need a strong commitment. I'm looking for a ring. How about, here's a suggestion, thank God for the Bible. How about, instead of harping on that one word commitment, why not address the fact that everything that you want, everything that you want to be and do and passions, it can still happen with a commitment. It's a different way of approaching the same problem. Let's go a little further. Every Bible, if you will, go real quick to Proverbs 3:27. The Father honored the Son. He accepted who he was. The Son was not breaking his commitment with him, but the Father was actually freeing him. Somebody read Proverbs 3:27 out loud to the class.
Withhold not good from them to whom it is due, when it is in the power of thine hand to do it.
Can everybody see that? The scripture encourages us, if you have the capability, the power, the opportunity to free somebody, to help them to do good, to better themselves, then why not do it? Why not allow them that opportunity? Verse 11 shows us the man had two sons. And again, too often in relationships, that important woman in the man's life tends to think that she has to be a mother. And the argument back is, well, Pastor, that's what he needs. You know, he needs a mother. I mother him because that's what he needs. He needs a mother. Let's go a little further. Let's go to look at verse 13 and 14. King James Version. Let me read it out loud. And not many days after, the younger son gathered together and took his journey into this far country, and there wasted his substance with riotous living. Verse 14. And then, makes it worse, then when he spent everything, there arose a mighty famine in that land, and he began to be in want. Now, one of the things that's real interesting, and I want to show you this in the Bible readers and studiers, if you notice, he spent everything. And then you also notice, then here comes this famine in the land, and here he began to be in want. Now, there's a famine in the land, and famine just simply means there's a drought. You know, there's a lack of resources. There's not this plenty. You know, there's the land is going through this period of drought. Well, as bad as it is, I want to recommend to you, I believe that he created this famine. There are two famines. There's a famine of a nation going through a period of a crisis, economical downturn where resources are not available, and we don't have a lot of control over that. But then, here's what we have control over. There's the famine that we create ourselves because of our own bad decisions. So here's somebody that's really in a rut. I mean, here's somebody that's in a messed up situation, and they really created all of this themselves. It had nothing to do with what's going on around. And one of the reasons why I know this was his personal famine is because later when we read about the prodigal son, we read about him eating with the pigs. And had this had been a true famine, it wouldn't be any pigs. Oh, come on, Memorial Day coming up. Y'all eat pork. Y'all eat ribs. Y'all know what I'm talking about. If it was a real famine, there would be no pigs. The pigs would have been devoured. So evidently, although it's a famine, there's still plentiful meat somewhere. And this particular young man has created his own famine. Now, I want to pause there, put a pin in this narrative, and I want to talk a little bit about his ego, because that's one of the questions that we wanted to address tonight. Let's talk a little bit about his ego. So now at this point, money is gone. At this point, he's depressed, he's hurt, life is not going very well. And let's sneak into verse 17, and because 16 talks about him eating with the swine, eating with the pigs. You go into verse 17, it says, and when he came to himself, this is thinking like a man, and when mentally he began to pull it all together, 17, he said, wait a minute, how many hired servants of my father that have bread. I'm thinking about, here I am, a son, and there are servants that work for my father that's living better than I am. Here I am in the pig's pen. Here I am waddling around with pigs. And this, and the Bible again says, King James Version, and when he came to himself. Let's talk about this male ego. The male ego can be compared to a woman's emotion. The male ego is very mysterious, and trying to understand the male ego is a struggle for all of us. The male ego is very sensitive. The male ego is very complex. There are certain things that we know about the male ego. We know, one, what all males have egos. Two, we know that the male ego can be bruised. A few things that we know. We know that the male ego can be bruised unintentionally. There are things that you can do you didn't even intend to say or do that could bruise, hurt, harm, and even destroy the male ego. So the male ego, let's kind of unpack that for a little bit. What does that really look like, the male ego? Yes, it's fragile. Yes, it is complex. But the male ego is needed. When God made us, this is last week's lesson, for those of you that weren't with us, we talked about from just a little bit of a refresher, repeating a little bit of last week's lesson. So when God made Adam, he literally made him from the dust of the earth. And the reason why that's so very important in understanding men and who we are dirty people. We're made of a little bit of dirt and then a little bit of heaven. A little bit of dirt because God, from the dust of the earth, he formed and shaped man. And then God, his own breath, Ruah, blew his breath into man. So now we have this human being that's made up of earth and then made up of heaven. And so, and men, this is where I need you to say, man. So every day we have earth pulling at us and we got heaven pulling at us. Let me say it again, man. Where's the men at in the house? Oh, okay, thank you. Because all of us supposed to be thinking like a man. I thought I would get the whole class to say, man, we all tonight thinking like a man. We'll bring our soprano amens in a couple of weeks here. So every day, men, I say that respectfully, we wake up and there's this pull to do something good, to do something right, this pull to be honest, this pull for pure thoughts. But then there's this other pull that's not always so nice, not always so holy, not always so righteous. And this constant pull, we find ourselves shifting Monday through Friday, Saturday, Sunday with this constant tug of war because we're a little bit of heaven and then a little bit of earth, a little bit of dirt and then a little bit of divinity. So God, in making, shaping, and forming man, gave us these egos. And as we unpack this ego, I think it's important that we note this. Watch the development of the ego. You take a boy, and a boy in his early childhood years spent a lot of time trying to impress his mother. Spends a lot of time trying to show mom his value, his worth. He can do it. I can be successful. And so here's this little boy, just grows up, and that's it. You know, he cleans his room or his sports, whatever he's involved in, he's trying to impress mom. One day, mom is no longer in the picture, whether she goes on to glory, distance, or whatever the situation, or this young man goes and marries. Now there's another woman in his life that is the important woman in his life. That ego has been developed. The early childhood years were just, when God first made us, he put the ego there. The childhood experiences developed the ego. And now, as a relationship is being entered into, there's this ego that needs to be nurtured, it needs to be developed. And who is it that's going to support it, nurture it, develop it? That is the next most important woman in this boy, young man's life. And yes, if that person, like significant other, the girlfriend, the wife, if she is not supporting, nurturing, developing that ego begins to get bruised. So let's talk tonight a little bit about what are some things that would feed the ego? What are some things that would develop the ego? Well, number one, I'll give you a couple lists. Number one, in feeding the ego, one of the ways to feed the male ego is simply by recognition. Just simple recognition. That feeds the ego. When I say simple recognition, that's looking at simple details. It has nothing to do with them actually doing something, just maybe details, whether it be the male having a haircut, the way he groom himself, the way, I don't know, wipe off his shoes, something that catches your eye that you notice. It has to be something that he does on a constant basis. You see it all the time, but you don't say anything about it. And so by you not saying anything about it, what happens to the male ego? Well, it's not being nurtured. It's not being developed. And that male ego begins to get wounded. It begins to get bruised when it can be developed through the recognition, number one, of details. Number two, women, when it comes to the male ego, what we're talking about is how do I feed this ego? I can feed the ego by allowing him to be a caretaker, allowing him to be a caretaker. That develops and nurtures the male ego. Now, women, one of the things that all women have, whether you know it or not, you have what I call, everybody repeat after me, say a girl card. A girl card. Yeah, a girl card, okay? See, everybody knows what a race card is. And based on what you're trying to do and accomplish, you might pull out your race card. You know, oh, they just don't care about us as, as African Americans, the race card. Well, every female has a girl card. There are times in the relationship where you can default to being a little girl again. Come on, man, I need some amens. And defaulting to being a girl again allows the man to man up. What we're talking about today is how do we bruise this male ego? Well, one of the ways that the male ego gets bruised is when the man doesn't have a chance or an opportunity to be the caretaker. If you don't create situations and opportunities for the man to be the man, then, talking about the male ego, then it's very easy for that man to take the back seat and feel not needed, not appreciated, and then at some point, why am I even here? She don't need me. Let's keep going, feeding the male ego. Another way of feeding the male ego, number three, is noticing a particular thing before he tells you. In every relationship, there's these patterns. There's these different expressions. There's these things that happen on a weekly to weekly basis. And part of nurturing men and their ego is really not waiting until he tells you, did you know I cleaned the living room? Did you know I washed the dishes? Did you know I cut the grass? Well, to nurture and develop this ego, why not beat him to it? Wow, you cut the grass today. Wow, that living room sure looks good today. Beforehand. Okay, let's go a little further. Talking about the male ego. Every Bible, real quick, let's go to Proverbs chapter 12, and I want us to look at verse 18. We just gave you 3 ways on how to develop and nurture the male ego. Let's talk about now how we can bruise the ego.
There is one who speaks like the piercing of a sword, but the tongue of the wise promotes health.
Beautiful. What translation is that? I'd like to hear it in a different. That's beautiful. Read.
It says it's the King James.
King James. Okay, good. The traditional King James. Let's hear that same one. Proverbs 12:18. I'd like to hear it in a different translation. Both of them are excellent. King James version uses the word healing. I love that word. That's great. Let's hear another translation.
NIV.
Okay.
The words of the reckless pierce like sword, but the
Okay. So 3 ways that the male ego is bruised. Number 1, everybody say language. Yes, especially women in a new love, a new relationship. The very words that I use can bruise the male ego. The very words that I use. That's number 1. Number 2, by being unsupportive. The reason why this word unsupportive pops back up again as we talk about the male ego is because the less support, I mean, think about a structure, even of this building, the foundation. The less support that's given for anything, it'll crumble. It'll begin to fall down. But once something is supported, so here's a clue, and this is good news for relationships, for married couples. If there's something in your spouse, in your mate, that you love, and you know, you whatever that thing is, whether it's him opening doors, whether it's him greeting you at the door, or maybe the phone call or the flirty text, whatever it is in the relationship that you really, really love, my question to you would be, do he know that you love it? I mean, is there this constant reinforcement that, you know, I need this, I love this? Because if he does, thinking like a man, if he don't know that what he is doing is of value to you, it begins to die, it begins to fade away, and then before we know it, there's really no interest for the man to do it because, well, it's not really being supported. Let's go a little further. We're talking about how the male ego is bruised. Well, number 3, the male ego is bruised from betrayal. So in every relationship, there's this fence. We all create these fences, and as soon as somebody go over the fence, they jump the fence, well, absolutely, that bruises the male ego. When you cannot be trusted in the relationship, that bruises the male ego. Now, here's another thing. This is still underneath number 3, underneath betrayal. Another form of betrayal is when the male is being compared to another male. Whether it's your favorite, I don't know a lot of TV stars, but can y'all help me on some of my examples? Who are some of these good-looking guys on TV? Who is it? Morris Chestnut. Who else? Chestnut. Who else? Shamar Moore. President Barack Obama. and what happens to the male ego when his woman is comparing him to some of these other individuals, especially as we talk about musicians and athletes, and the list goes on and on and on and on. Another form of betrayal and breaking trust. Let's go a little further. Ready? We talked about how the male ego is bruised. Let's talk about now, I want to give you 3 ways that women unintentionally bruise the male ego. This is all unintentional. You know, it was just, you started off saying, we're just going to have dinner. And now look at us. Don't even want to, you know, separate, don't even want to talk, don't even want to, you know, we need space. And it just started off with a simple dinner. Let's pull 3 things unintentionally that can bruise the male ego, and we may not even know it. Tonight, we're thinking like a man. Number 1 is when you insult his job. His job. Remember, he can bash his job all he wants. He can talk about his job, what he don't like. His supervisor, the co-workers, they're no good. He might not even think much of his job. Oh, honey, I'm just doing this just for, you know, temporarily, whatever. But that's not your place to insult his job. Because at the end of the day, the male, his value is tied into what he do. And so if I'm mad and I'm frustrated and things not just going the way that I want them to go, and I'm venting, I'm not venting for you to tear down or to devalue what I do, because that's tied into who I am. Let's go a little further. 3 ways how we unintentionally bruise the ego. Number 1 is insulting his job. Number 2 is when we treat him like he don't have any money. Let me say that one again. When you treat him like he don't have any money, your words back is, well, he don't have any money. Well, don't treat him like he don't have any money. Because, you know, in every relationship, there's these periods where tables turn. I was just in a relationship I was just in a conversation this week with Brother Haley. We had a great conversation. We were talking about just life and how things have turned. And one of the things, Brother Haley, and we all know that he lost his wife, Sister Haley, and the couple themselves just been a blessing to our church at large. But one of the things that he talked about through sickness on both sides was how he said, you know, God was working mysteriously in our relationship where if she was down, I was up. And when I was down, she was up. And they were able to have such this beautiful chemistry in their relationship because somebody was caring for the other at all times. And we know Sister Haley had multiple hip replacements, and Brother Haley had some health issues. But it was amazing how that worked together, one for the other, backwards and forwards. And I say that to say, look at what happens, how a relationship moves forward and is successful based on how we treat each other. Even if that person, don't miss the point, don't have any money. A season of, for Brother Haley, was a season of sickness and health that took them up and down. My example is today, even if there's unemployment, there's a season of no income on behalf of the male, that don't mean that you have to treat him like that, like it'll always be that way. So let's say we go to dinner and you're on the other end and you pay for the last 19, 20 dinners. And it's starting to get kind of old because you're saying, wow, you know, I would think that things would have changed by now. Let's not treat him, because remember, for the male, not only who he is, what he does, but we're talking about bruising the male ego. Your comments, your language, your actions, especially at that vulnerable state, destroys the relationship. An alternative would be speaking of the future. Honey, I'm paying for this one, but you can, you know, your first check, you can get the next one. Or, you know, there are ways that we can put hope inside of that relationship. Unintentional. So number one, insulting his job. Number two, not treating him like he is poor. And then number three, we hit on that already. There should be no competition in the relationship. So let me use my last 7 minutes, and I'm prayerfully you have a number of questions that we'll review next week just from today's lesson. But let me kind of bring some conclusion to what we're talking about tonight. One of the reasons why in a relationship we deal as women with these bruised egos. Tonight's lesson was not about blaming you and saying that you are the blame for these bruised egos. But one thing that we must take note of, it is very possible, and I know I'm gonna get some amens on this one, that the ego was bruised before it got to you. It's very possible that the ego had already been bruised or damaged. And so now here you are, before you're so fast to point your finger at yourself and say, you know, maybe, yes, there are some things that I should do differently. There's some things that I need to revisit. Also, we have to consider what happened before you all met, before the new love. And I bring that to your attention because for the men, whenever we are at a point in our lives where we cannot listen to the mistakes we've made, that we're not embracing healing. Whenever we're at a point where we no longer want any feedback, we don't want anybody to say anything about our lives, when we begin to, a sure sign that our egos is bruised and we don't want healing is isolation. When I get to myself, by myself, and I don't want any people interaction, I don't want to deal no longer with phone calls and date life, that's a sure sign that I am declining healing, the opportunity to be healed. And then that becomes the flip-flop. And we see it in the prodigal son, because when he was at his lowest point, I would go into it now, but we just don't have time. The scripture actually say he rose, which lets us know he was bending over, or he was kneeling, whatever it was, he was down. And the scripture says that when he arose, again, he came to himself, which is an act of humility. Men, there's healing tonight. If you want to move from where you are, if you really want to get a closeness with not only your spiritual life, but with God and even with your mate, your spouse, is done through an act of humility. I noticed that it wasn't until the prodigal son, he came to himself once he began to rise up, once he began to really realize who he was, and then he began again to make those steps towards coming back home. If we're not open to listening at our mistakes, if we're not open to being flexible, if we are geared toward isolation, then we are shutting the door to healing. Let me close with a story. And this story was told to me. I thought it was so appropriate. I wanted to share it with you tonight. There was a father at the supermarket pushing his son in a little grocery store cart, and this little newborn baby in the cart and just crying up and down the aisle. By the time they got to the second aisle, here's his dad, decided, I got to hurry up and get it done. And so he begins to say, just hang in there, Marcus. Hang in there, Marcus. And he continues to do what he's doing and trying to knock this list out, get over to aisle 3. Hang in there, Marcus. Just come on, hang in there, Marcus. About another 5 minutes. Hang in there, Marcus. And he gets all the way to the cash register. A lady in front of him said, sir, man, you came in together. She said, and I just want to commend you. She said, you've really done a great job. She said, I heard you. She said, I was right there in the aisle. I've been hearing you all through the shopping experience. Hang in there, Marcus. Hang in there, Marcus. She said, just wanted to say, you're doing a great job. He said, ma'am, his name is Alvin. My name is Marcus. And so, man, the moral of the story, sometimes you have to encourage yourself. God bless you tonight. Thank you for listening. Next week, I pray that you have retrieved or pulled at least a question from tonight's lesson. We'll go back to our normal format next week, and we're going to open it up, and we're going to create some discussion. But thank you for kind of putting on the hat of thinking like a man, kind of hearing a little bit of how we think, how we're wired. We'll take some additional questions from this particular lesson next week, and we will unpack it as a class. And then after that, our direction is really to do the exact same thing for thinking like a woman. Men, we were a little shy tonight, but we'll appreciate it, if not tonight, later on this week. Amen. Amen.